Okay, I was going to have you do some more reading for next week, but I decided we've got all these. I think everybody's either you have signed up or you will sign up today for a team, and so you can get started. And so I would just as soon. I think it's good. Let's just jump into it. These are some very interesting subjects, and I'd like to get your project one assignments completed fairly quickly. Um, I'm a little bit unsure. You are working as a team, so how long do you guys need to do this? What do you think? You have an idea of how long you need to complete this assignment? I'm thinking 3 weeks should be enough, right? You've got 3 or 4 people on a team. You have audio. You have to create some visuals with it, obviously. Um, anyway, so I'm not giving you homework this week so you can get started on it. So I'm going to say, at least for the moment, unless somebody talks me out of it, that we will have project one done in 3 weeks. Um, today is week 3, so basically the end of the 3 weeks from today. So that'd be week 6 class. We should be done by then. I think you can do that. I will try to take it a little bit light on you in homework, although I really haven't been getting a lot of homework anyway. About an hour's worth. This last one was a little bit hard with all that reading, but usually we're not doing that much. So I think you can get it done. Um, any questions on that? One of the groups asked me some questions, and I said I'd answer them. And remind me what the questions were, or anybody else have any questions about this assignment? So I did write some details someplace. Um, so we want it to be, about 20 minutes. And with that short of one, then we contrary to what we said originally, we need to keep the amount of audio we borrow. It's kind of like the reason why I've called it a review is that um, you're allowed, and at least by American law, if you're reviewing something, you are allowed to use some of the original content. And so um, I think if we're down to, if it's a 20-minute presentation, um, then we're looking at maybe, just 20% would be 4 minutes, right? Yeah. So you might, I know I wrote it down someplace else. I'm sorry where I wrote it now. And don't want to go searching for it. So don't use a whole lot of video of the audio, or in some cases you have videos instead of audio, by the way. But same situation. Don't use an excessive amount, which means you're writing your own script. You're summarizing an hour-long workshop um, in 20 minutes. So you have to obviously watch the workshop or listen to it. Take very careful notes. You may want to transcribe some of it. What you read from it is, you can extend their content a little bit by reading some yourself rather than using original audio or video, whatever you're getting. Um, but anyway, so try to represent the most important parts. Don't, obviously, you can't cover everything, right? You can't crunch an hour into 20 minutes. If you try to cover everything, it's just going to be bad. It's not going to be high quality. And so you need to review your multimedia file, whatever it might be, and and decide what's the most important. What is most important to you? Just like as a newspaper journalist or an editor, you have to always be making decisions based on your own gut feelings. Now that may make you, if you don't have a good gut feelings about things, if you don't have a good nose for news, if you don't have a, make good judgment, then you're probably not going to be a good journalist. But how else can you figure it out? How else can you decide what should I write about that other people will be interested in? How can you decide as an editor what should I put on the front page that should be of most interest to our readers? You don't have time to take a survey. So you really have to trust your own instincts in what to do. And that's what I'm asking you to do with this project is review the audio or video file that you have requested and has been assigned to you, and use your own instincts as to what is most important for me to understand in the future, and therefore that I will want to share with the other people in class. We will put all of your videos on the internet. So that's why we need to be careful about using excessive amounts of their material. If they feel like it's excessive, then they will block our use of it. So we don't want that. So again, if your use of their original audio or video is down to about 4 minutes, and the rest is your graphics and your own voiceover and so forth, then I'm hoping that they won't object to our putting them on YouTube, and then we'll put them embed them back into Moodle. We won't have time probably to assign all of them during the semester, but I will go through them as I'm grading them and decide which ones I think I should require as homework for people to watch. And so, other questions? I know there were some questions that one of the teams asked me, and I now forget what the questions were. But anyway, any questions? Anybody? The answers. You want to get a good grade, so if you have any questions, you want to ask the questions now so you can get a good grade. Okay, well, again, we're passing the sheet, so if somebody's not on a team, you have a choice of there's quite a few teams that have only 3 members, so you do have a choice of joining somebody's team that only has 3 members, or you have a choice of signing into one of the other presentations that currently has no team members on it and starting your own team. Okay, I'm going to, there was part of last week's presentation that I wanted to go back to. I'm trying to remember whether I played any of this. I guess I know I had you watch some of your own, so I'm going to go skip that. This is what I did want to cover. It's, as I mentioned, this guy is politically very contrary to my way of thinking. But he's talking about some of the kind of the psychological aspects of communication, and that I think we need to think about. And it is kind of a psychological part of framing, whether you like it or not. You are framing your stories in a certain way based on your own life experience and how you want to write the story. There's lots of things that dictate how you frame, and one of them is purely psychological. And this guy, who is one of the kind of pioneers in that field of framing, basically says, for example, in one of these that he's analyzing Trump, and he's very anti-Trump, but he's saying that basically Trump can't change. It's impossible for him to change. But the way he has a certain style that he can convince a lot of people to think just like he does. And so he talks about how he does that. I would suggest that professors do that too, that the professor like him and me also have our own frames and also our own symbols that we use, and we frame things in such a way that it makes total sense to somebody, but we are all presenting a, you might call a prima facie case. You may know what that means, a prima facie case? In American law, that means basically the case you need to make in order to get an indictment, if you're not screwing with the system anyway. And it's a one-sided case. So it's a case only where only you present your side. And you have to be able to show a judge that you have a case with no opposition that is adequate to put somebody in jail pending trial. And so that's a prima facie case, the one-sided, unopposed case that justifies arresting somebody, basically, and keeping him in jail until trial. They might be out on bail. They have to put some money up and guarantee that they'll come back, and that's up to the judge too. So in essence, we as professors every day present you a prima facie case on something, and so do politicians and others who are trying to argue a certain perspective, and that is their frame. You are getting a one-sided presentation. Whoever gives it to you is almost always, there are exceptions where people go out of their way to present two sides of a story, but how good they are at it is a whole other question. The Wall Street Journal the other day talked about a divided America, and I responded to it on Facebook. Not that they were wrong about America being divided, and not even necessarily being wrong about how part of the description they have of who's on one side of the division and who's on the other side of the division, except it made the other side of the division, the side other than them, sound pretty stupid. They only emphasize, well, that side is not as well educated as those on this side. So our side is educated, their side is stupid. Our side has most of the money. The strong economies are in New York City and Los Angeles and all the big cities, and they're all out there in the farmland and they don't make much money, and they're kind of pushing them off as being not worth very much. But those people out in that farmland are people like my brother who they can be worth many millions of dollars. People out there are usually not worth billions. So yeah, the billionaires are typically in the cities. There's a lot of millionaires out in the countryside that are not stupid. And there's a lot of people that are well educated, but a lot of them are somewhat self-educated. They have not spent much time in university being indoctrinated, such as my brother. But he's had to learn how to run a business. He's had to learn how to take care of his finances and taxes, and he has to figure out how to understand law about insurance and investments and things he has to deal with every day. He has to deal with property ownership and taxes and buying new property and running a business with 50 employees and handling the HR because he can't afford an HR specialist because he has a small business, not a big one. So he has to take the role of the CEO, the HR director, the marketing director, etc. Those are the small business people. They can be worth a lot of money, not in billions, but in millions. Anyway, Wall Street Journal is kind of looking down their nose at those, and so I refuted their framing of their article. Yes, there is a division in America, but I'm in favor of that other division they scoff at, because actually small businesses create most of the jobs in America. They may not always be the highest paying jobs, and the creators of those jobs may not be billionaires. They're millionaires, or in some cases going broke. They're the ones that are having to face alone some very difficult regulations from the federal government because they can't afford in-house lawyers and in-house accountants and in-house people like that. So to them, yes, they are conservative because they're facing the brunt, whereas somebody um, that is a billionaire running, one of the, running Microsoft or whatever. Um, they've got people to do all their work, so they can afford to be liberal. Um, anyway, the point is that it's a frame. And even if you're trying to, and I'm not saying that Wall Street Journal, that story, didn't try to frame it fairly, but they couldn't. The writers clearly did not understand anything outside of the city, outside of the urbanized areas of America, which make up they make up a very small geographic area within America. And yet they do control most of the money, that's true. And they may have a lot of PhDs in those areas, more than out in the countryside. That's true. But the people out in the countryside, they're my people. And I think they're worth defending. So framing. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my recording, and we'll watch. So do we just give up? What do you think about what he's saying? He's basically saying that you guys are basically being programmed like a bunch of robots. You started off with your parents, your churches, your government, your whatever. We're all just programmed like a bunch of robots, and we can't do anything about it. I don't know. I think there is some truth about it. I mean, this guy's really, really smart. There's no doubt about that. I disagree with his. I mean, the problem is with his analysis of Trump, is that presumes that he has the right analysis, and that Trump has the wrong analysis of reality. That he has the right frame, and that Trump has the wrong frame. He has the right frame, that I have the wrong frame. That's his. How else can he look at the world? Because by his own science, he's saying we don't control it. That's kind of it is a frustrating way of looking at life. I mean, it isn't that different than what I told you in day one, right? When I talked about our conceptual framework, that we are building this conceptual framework. He has a little bit different way of looking at it, but it's still pretty much the same thing. And so I guess I'd kind of came to the same conclusion, but with a different, he's talking about metaphors, a different metaphor perhaps. But it is hard to escape our own conceptual framework. He's just calling, psychological frames, and he's saying it's actually physical. And I guess I mentioned that the first day too. It is physical. We start building these, neuron connections in our brain, and so it becomes actually a physical detriment to our understanding of reality. Yeah, that's not real good to me. But, I mean, I guess, anyway, so you put that now, that may give you a little bit different perspective on communications research. Because if this is true, that changes a lot of, just pretty much everything. This is kind of the conclusion I came to when I was doing my master's degree, is that these sorts of influence are so strong that we're kind of looking at, in some cases, we're looking at the wrong issues. When we start looking at, we're using some of these other theories, when it becomes so basic as this, the other theories become a little bit irrelevant, in a sense. The other theories are not going to work for us when we look at things. I think I showed it to you before, but that's why I've created, this kind of, I kind of went inside out, so to speak. But we have the public down here. Those are the info consumers, I said. And the people out here, I kind of tried to represent how influential they were by how big the circle was. So out here you have a bunch of people that are info creators. So in the political sphere, those are people like the president, the prime minister here in Malaysia, people who wield a certain amount of power and respect and credibility, that what they say becomes news. And so they're out here. And then in between, we have, I think I actually maybe represent it like this. I have to go back to my thesis. Because it's not one person, it's an organization now. And within this organization, you have people that are very influential and people that are less influential. And these people are all interacting with each other. Anyway, so you have these spheres of people interacting with each other. You have social things going on. You also have the psychological makeup. So if you go back in time, this person here, let's say this is Trump, you can go all the way back in time, and these people around him are his parents, for example. Now, they were influential on him. So you can go back and look at the psychological, as he was saying, Trump can't help but be Trump. He had people influencing him starting from birth. And so you start looking at it, at the model that is as complex as it really is, between psychological and sociological impacts on us. I think I mentioned last time that out here in Congress, let's say, they can create predictive models where if you can find certain relationships, you can predict with 97% accuracy how they're going to vote on anything. So that becomes a sociological impact, perhaps, or an indicator. Is it the impact? Did they choose those friends because they think alike, or do they influence each other that way? Maybe both, probably both. They're trying to decide how to vote on a certain issue, and so they're talking to each other, and so they come up with some decision. Anyway, it gets very complicated. Very complicated. And then you get down that very psychological part where we're talking about conceptual frameworks and how to deal with them. One thing that I was really concerned about with my master's degree was, I think I told you already, was the concept of dogmatism. And if you look that up, I'm not sure what you say, exactly what it says. Let's look it up. I forget now how exactly they would put that into words. I'm going to just look that up. Change. Let's get the right definition. Okay, the tendency to lay down principles is undeniably true without consideration of evidence or the opinions of others. So I was studying dogmatism. This says it's Wilton Rokic, but there's somebody else that had created a test, and I was trying to remember the famous name, but I don't want to say the wrong name. But anyway, so the idea of dogmatism is, as I interpreted it, more or less, a closed mind. That's somebody who won't listen to other ideas and won't give them any serious consideration. I think that is how you really do try to avoid a conceptual framework that's too rigid. It has to become part of your conceptual framework has to be the importance of listening, the importance of understanding somebody else's perspective. If that's not built into your conceptual framework, then you've got a problem. Then you're stuck. You're absolutely stuck in a dogmatic perspective that you can't escape from. One of the things that bothers me about America currently, just yesterday, just in the last couple of days, for example, Homeland Security, that's in charge of protecting the U.S. from illegal aliens or terrorists coming in or anything else that might be in any way perceived as a threat. The acting director of it was invited to go speak at Georgetown University, one of the most prestigious universities in America. And he was talking to law students. He was to talk to law students about the legal quandary that he and others are in, because the law says to do this, and a lot of the people, including university students, are saying, no, you can't do that. That's immoral. The law says but it was Congress that passed the law. And the law says they have to enforce the law. And these people are saying, no, that's unethical, immoral, you can't enforce the law. But the Democrats were among those who passed the law. And those same Democrats are now mouthing what these protesters are saying for dogmatic reasons. Dogmatism in that sense, that's dogmatism. They're trying to basically just parrot their biases for popularity purposes. And so they're parroting what the protesters are saying, and yet they themselves voted for the laws that are in place. And so this is particularly frustrating. But anyway, get back to the point. Here are these supposedly liberal students. And this is where I said that actually the name of the term liberal has been turned on its head. The liberal student, the idea actually of liberal was that you're open to a lot of ideas. That was kind of the idea of the word liberal, is that you are freed from dogmatism to listen to all ideas and to grow from those ideas. That's kind of the original idea of having a liberal education. That's what they call it in America. In fact, that's why in American journalism programs that I've complained about, they only allow about 25% journalism courses. 75% have to be everything else, because they want them to have a liberal education. And that's not clear in this case. But what it meant was that they wanted them to be exposed to lots of ideas. And they were supposed to be open to them. Liberals are supposed to be open to all these ideas. Getting back to my story, so the head of Homeland Security goes to talk to law students about the problem he faces and the government faces, that the law says this and these people are saying this. And even the Democrat people who voted for this are saying this. And they booed and yelled and screamed and would not let him say one word. Not let him say one word. And that's what's happening on American campuses right now. Any conservative who shows up to try to talk, they do not want to listen to them. They will shout them down. They've even started riots and burn cars and stuff like that in Berkeley, supposedly the most liberal university in America. When a conservative showed up there, they started burning cars, turning over cars and stuff to stop that person from talking. That's the most anti-liberal attitude you could possibly have. We will not listen to you. We will turn over cars, start fires to stop you, yell and scream. We will stop you from giving us your opinion. That's what worries me about America right now. And while they like to call President Trump a fascist, that he's going to be the next Hitler, the problem is that's exactly what happened before Hitler did come into power. It was the Nazis who were yelling and screaming, burning books, not letting the opposition speak. And what you read today, what was the example of the spiral of silence? Spiral of silence. What's that all about? What's your best example? What's their best example? Anybody who talks about the spiral of silence, what's their best example for that theory? Nazi Germany. Yeah, that most of the people that were in Germany at the time Hitler was coming to power opposed what he was doing. But the people that supported him became so radical, so violent, so loud that the silent majority could not be heard, and they were afraid to be heard. They were afraid to speak out, and so they were quiet. And so the whole world paid for their silence. That's what's happening in America right now, but it's exactly, it's a little bit of combination of spiral silence and 1984. And at the same time that they're silencing other people, they're saying that those other people are the fascists. It is really bizarre and scary to me. Anyway, but this idea of framing it, I think it was not covered in the textbook, at least not as a primary theory. But it is, I think, a very important one. It does relate to things like agenda setting, and other issues that occur within the media that we've already talked about some of that. So, by the way, I was going to mention, I've kind of touched on the subject before. I mentioned that ours is one of the few fields where the professionals feel that they are not interested in the theories and research that we do. The professional journalist could care less what our research says. In fact, and like I said, I think I told you in my research, I asked them if they, who they'd hire, if somebody with a PhD or somebody with a master's degree, everything else being equal, same amount of experience, everything else being equal, and they did not want the PhD in the place. They would not hire a PhD. And I compared that to my brother's field in agronomy, where any big company that could afford him would have hired my brother. Because what he knew and what he researched was of importance to the industry. And there's a lot of PhDs, a lot of programs that are like that, where the research is pivotal to the industry. I mean, you think of medicine, obviously pivotal. Just lots of areas where certainly law is one of those areas. Business research tends to be fairly practical. They're looking at, how to make business. But you see, that could have happened in journalism. It could have been that the first researchers that got involved in journalism might have been business people, but they weren't. The first people that got involved in academic research in journalism were psychologists and sociologists. And so that's where we're at now. Our research is based in sociology and psychology, and that's why it's of very little interest to the professionals, is that they don't see that as being, kind of interesting maybe once in a while, but do we apply it on a day-to-day basis? Not really. And so when I floated the idea, well, how about a doctorate that involved, that is cross-departmental? You learn some HR, you learn other management, you learn marketing, you learn IT, you learn the key elements of running your business, and at the same within your business, and at the same time cross media. So you're not just an expert on newspapers like myself, but I get some more training with my doctorate on broadcast media and web media, for example. So that I come out with broader skills and broader broader skills within the various media, and broader skills within the organizational skills. Would you be interested in that? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. In other words, as I said before, it's a little more like, um, well, an MBA obviously is not a doctorate, but um, and so that's where they do separate a little bit there. I don't think that the average MBA is seen as very high esteem in the industry. A doctor of business, not so much. Um, but in some areas, that PhD again in law, just to be a lawyer. So in some states, you have to have a doctorate of law. That is your entrance into the industry. Is your JD, your Juris Doctorate. In medicine, same thing. You have to have a doctorate to be a doctor. You have to have a doctor of medicine, and so forth. So anyway, so it's our perspective of research in our industry is shaded by our history. And I've been trying to break out of that a little bit. So a lot of my research has been more about the business. And as you think about your own research, you might think about other, breaking out of the psychological, sociological issues and look at more of the business issues, for example, the technological issues, things like that. So let's come back to the video here a second. So he's talking about framing and talking about purely from a psychological sense. So how can we associate that with framing from a media sense? Is it fair for me to say it's almost the same? I mean, it's basically the same thing. You're just putting his framing into a situation. Isn't that basically what we talk about when we're talking about framing? Except we do talk about how we frame it for our recipients. So we do put it, that's more or less what he's saying that Trump does for his recipients, that he's framing the issue of taxes as, tax relief rather than, the loss of services. The liberal perspective is when you cut taxes, you lose services. When you cut regulations, you lose protection. And so how you frame that issue is very important as the media shares it to the public. And if the president can, indeed, as he's saying, that the president can frame it for them and keep hammering, this is tax relief, this is the deregulation in order to enhance the economy, to help deregulate for these small businesses that are being put under pressure by excessive regulation. What he didn't say when he talked, he put again the liberal frame on regulation. Just under Obama, more than 1 million pages of new regulations were put into place. Just under Obama, the ability for government agencies to create regulations without Congress approving them, by the way. The regulations he's talking about have never been approved by Congress, so it's turned the American Constitution on its head also, is that when it was created, the idea was only one body creates law. That's Congress. Nobody else creates law. But now the Supreme Court basically creates law. It says, no, if you send people in with this sort of, if you handle them a certain way, we're going to let them go. So in other words, they set a law, the attorney or the judges in the Supreme Court are setting law. This is our decision, and you cannot break our decision. This is our law. Meanwhile, the agencies, and Congress gave them this power, the agencies in America create regulations. As I mentioned, just under Obama, 1 million pages of regulation. And the agencies have been building regulation for decades now. So I don't know how many millions of pages there are of regulation in America. But that's why somebody like my brother, who has a company with 50 people in it, he has to become an expert in regulation, and that amount of regulation is maybe very destructive to his business. Whereas, with Microsoft, they've got a lawyer full time looking at all the regulations. No big deal to them. And to somebody who doesn't have a business, almost every regulation in America has to do with a business, not to the general public. And so all those little businesses that don't have on-staff lawyers and stuff, they're the ones that are being impacted by Obama's million pages of regulations and those millions of pages that were created before Obama came into office. So, of course, he doesn't talk about that. He's just talking about their purpose. Their purpose is to protect the public. I understand that. But a million pages just under Obama, you really need, let's say Obama made half of all regulations. This isn't true. He made, there were plenty of regulations before he came along. But let's say there's only 2 million pages of regulations. Only 2 million pages. You have to start a business, you have to become an expert in 2 million pages. Yeah, lots of luck with that. So, yeah, you have a different perspective, and he, as a professor, can afford to look at it from one perspective, whereas my brother, who's running his business with 50 employees, from a different perspective. I can kind of afford to be kind of in the middle a little bit. I grew up the son of a farmer and we'll look at a whole bunch of regulations. Farmers in America have lots of problems with totally good environmental regulations. If you're a farmer and they have just passed, even if it's only 200,000 pages of environmental regulations that affect a farmer, I couldn't handle that, right? No farmer could handle that. And yet that's what they're facing. And to him, that's a good thing because they're protecting the world from my dad, okay? Because my dad didn't handle chemicals right on the farm. He did something wrong. And so they can go put him out of business if they want to. So there's two sides to these, and it's not that hard to try to force your brain to understand both sides. It can be frustrating because you're not sure how you can reconcile those two sides. You have this farmer here trying to make a living, working his backside off 16 hours a day, and you have this professor over here worried about the public when he doesn't have to worry about those regulations. He's not going to have to worry about them. So anyway, it's the framing, the psychological framing he's talking about, I think very much is related to the framing as we talk about it. As writers frame, as editors, in some cases, control the frame before they ever make the assignment. Here, go and do this, and they set the frame. Back when one of the IRE conferences I went to had a panel discussion. And as we've talked about before, most media in America are controlled by liberals. And so they invited one conservative editor on a panel of 5 people. And it was good because at least that one guy could kind of pin them down and force them to answer some tough questions. And so it was the Washington, D.C. Editor for the New York Times who said, yeah, we do have to deal with the problem that most of our and this was back in the 1980s, by the way, so it's only gotten worse in a sense. He said most of our reporters are liberal, and so if you give them a choice between doing a story about waste in national defense or waste in welfare programs that feed the poor, which one are they going to do? They're going to choose the story about waste in national defense. They're not concerned about national defense. They are, to them, feeding the poor is much more important. So they will ignore the fraud in the welfare, even though it means actually the money isn't getting to where it wants to go, or where it should go, in order to do the story about the waste in national defense they don't care about. That is a part of framing, but it's also, because part of framing, also then obviously leads into the agenda setting. who's setting the agenda. It's not always the editors. The editors are definitely involved with agenda setting, but it is also the individual reporters. In classes of mine, I've taught, you have to keep a list of important, stories you'd like to write about, so that you always have a good story idea ready to go. And in fact, because you can't always get the sources you want, you may be working on 3 or 4 stories at the same time, because you have suddenly access to people you need to interview for one story, whereas you can't get a hold of other ones. So you're working on several stories at once. But nonetheless, who's making that list? You're making that list. That reporter is making the list. That reporter is looking at life through a frame, and that he's making a decision of what stories do I want to pursue based on his world frame that they're just talking about. And so that is the process of agenda setting. What's important to me? I just told you, by the way, that you have to make that decision. I actually gave you that assignment to decide what you thought was important as you go through the IRE audios and videos, because it's kind of hard to do otherwise. How else will you decide what to use in your audio or your video, in your, as you create your own video, other than using your own frame of what's important? How can you work otherwise? And so it is the research in our area is maybe one of the most complicated areas, because communications relates to so many things. It does relate to psychology. It relates to sociology. It relates to business. It relates to technology. It relates to, everything. Well, what does communication not relate to? It relates to everything, which is why, some people are doing theses on esports. So it relates to sports. It relates to everything. So it makes the more things it relates to, the more complicated it becomes. And the process of it then complicates all of those activities. We were talking a little bit last week about the control of this, and my argument has always been that journalists themselves exert far more control in America, in America anyway, far more control than corporations or government or just about anybody else, anybody else at this point. They're the ones that make those day-to-day decisions, the frontline decisions, what to cover, what not to cover, what to say is important, what to say not important, how to write their stories, which words to use. Do you refer to certain groups as the ultra-right, or you just call them conservative? How do you refer to them? What kind of adjectives do you use when you choose your words? Where do you put if you do take the time to get a balanced story in the sense of talking to both sides, first off, can you even hear and understand what one side is saying if you are diametrically opposed to them? If you absolutely do not believe what Trump is saying, can you even hear what he's saying in a sense? Can you really comprehend what he's saying? Because you hate him. How can you comprehend him? You hate him. You hate every idea that he says. You cannot represent. I mean, if you were asked to be his PR person, could you do it? No, because you hate him too bad. And in a sense, you have to put on a hat almost like a PR person and just understand him and just understand his perspective. If you hate him too bad to do that, then you simply can't do that. And so your story becomes one-sided. Even if you take the time to talk to a conservative and a liberal, if you're a liberal, you can't understand what the conservatives are saying, and vice versa. And which is, again, showing itself up in the polarization in America that concerns me. Well, I want to go on then and talk a little bit about where people are getting their news. And I think we just touched on this a little bit last week, but I want to go into some of the other charts we didn't get to. Again, I mentioned that back in about 2016, in that era, The internet became more important than TV in America and in Great Britain. This is actually in Great Britain here, but it's the same thing happened in America at the same time. But the internet became more important as a source of news than TV. And the print is collapsing, as we talked about before. It's the dependence on newspaper is dropping very fast. We talked about this, I think, briefly. I'm going to go back and not where I want to be here. There. Okay. We'll use this one instead. Anyway, so we see one of the important parts about this, like New York Times is still making money, with the average age of a New York Times subscriber is about 55. So if the average age of a New York Times reader is 55, they've got about maybe 25 more years of life at best. Because when those people, when their average readers die, they're dead too. Because look at this chart here. We've got over here under TV, you see the older generation, 55 or older. They're getting most of their news from TV still. And look over here at people your age. Almost nobody's getting their information from TV anymore. Okay? So you see what's going to happen when these people die. Is TV irrelevant anymore? For after about 20 years here, TV becomes irrelevant, and it'll become worse because these trends are actually becoming stronger, not less. And so even a lot of the 55 and older people like myself, I never watch TV. Okay, and there's more people like me that have given up on TV already. And so even this is not representative of what it will be in 20 years. Even the 55-year-olds are, and of course by then they're 75 or whatever, but they will no longer be watching TV either. You look at back at the other end online. Oops, wrong thing here, wrong button. Yeah, I can't even see it. Anyway, on the far side, you see the blue line in the far under online. That includes social media. That set of columns. And so, the younger people are getting all their stuff online, whereas only 21% of people my age are even quite a bit younger than me even. Those that are 55 and older, only 21% are getting their news off the internet. I think that's going to change rather rapidly. As I said, even among that group, they're going to start getting more and more off the internet. And so this chart's going to become more extreme. In fact, this is, I'm just trying to find the dates on this. I think this is a little bit dated already anyway. But so that's again when somebody from India, a student in India, challenged me when I was speaking there a couple of years ago. Said our newspapers are strong here; they're not going to disappear. Yeah, follow the trends. They're going to disappear. Even in India, they're going to disappear. Just a matter of when. Maybe there's some new technology that has to accommodate the people in India. Maybe some economic things have to happen. Maybe somebody has to invent a different type of internet tool. Something's going to happen economically, sociologically, something technically, and they're going to abandon the newspaper. On top of that, you have the problem of that traditional media costs more than online media, dramatically more. I may have mentioned this in class, but one of the studies that got me writing the idea of how to save the New York Times was the fact that when they calculated it, if they stopped printing in 1 year, their profits from not printing would pay for giving everybody an iPad. And so, the economics of an iPad, the economics of online are so much more affordable than the economics of printing, that at some point, and by the way, one of the reasons why I was successful in some of my business negotiations was that I understood something that I was talking about recently. I guess as Clayton Christensen was talking about how businesses who understand that certain things are becoming demonetized have an advantage strategically over those who don't get it yet. And so what I understood from a young age is that paper and ink doesn't cost much. It's not paper and ink that costs so much in publishing a newspaper. It's the labor, it's the equipment, it's the overhead, everything except the paper and ink. Paper and ink is cheap. And so one way that I was able to double my revenue when I bought my first newspaper was understanding that. And so I started making special deals and selling, making a deal with businesses that if they would, instead of just taking like one ad a month, if they take out a weekly ad, I would give them a lot of freebies with it. I give them, once a year. If they signed a contract, full year contract for a small ad, 4 times a year, I'd give them a full page ad from a broadsheet page. I give them a full size page 4 times a year. 4 times a year, I give them a half page ad, so forth. And I did that because I realized paper and ink didn't cost anything hardly. It just didn't cost very much. In addition, another thing I understood was that the bigger I got, the bigger my newspaper was, the more people thought I was successful. So it's like driving, an expensive car, Mercedes. You drive an expensive car, people think what about you? You must be really successful. So some people buy that car just to get that image. Even if they can't afford it, they figure out a way. They're going to have a Mercedes because they want people, especially let's say they're selling stock or something. They're selling investments, expensive investments. They're not going to drive up in a $1,000 used car. They want to drive up in that new Mercedes so that the people they're selling to think, oh, he's one of us. He understands how to make money. He must be doing a good job here. And so it's kind of the same concept. If you have a lot of pages in a newspaper, people think you must be successful. Therefore, if other people are taking ads out, then they should take out ads too. So by giving a special deal to people and giving them a full page ad once in a while, it made other people think, gee, we should buy a full page ad too. Because, look at all these other people buying full page ads. And so just the image of what I created by creating these special contracted offers of, again, you buy a weekly ad, a small weekly ad, I'll give you a full page ad 4 times a year, half page ad 4 times a year, quarter page ad 4 times a year, and you're only paying as if you're taking that 1/8 page ad. So it helped them think bigger, think about one of the key principles of advertising that they didn't understand because they're a small business is that you have to run campaigns. A one-time ad does not do anything. To be effective in advertising, you have to run campaigns, just like a politician would. You run a campaign, an ad campaign. Anyway, so the people I was selling to didn't understand that. So also what I was doing is teaching them, in a way, the important principle of advertising, which is, you can't just do one little ad once in a while. It has no effect, almost no effect for you. So I was helping them get better, be more effective. At the same time, by them having bigger ads, more people wanted to buy ads, and in 1 year, I doubled their revenue. Anyway, so a lot of newspapers, meanwhile, they are stuck with all these overhead costs. And as their advertising drops, they can no longer afford to keep going. And some of those expenses are the same whether you print 1,000 copies or 1,000,000 copies. There are some expenses that are going to be pretty much the same. And so your overhead is much higher with the fewer copies you print. Okay, and anyway, another one. I think we did talk about that one. I'm going to skip over that, get ahead, go on. I think we talked about that one. Okay, so tipping points. A tipping point, that concept was created about 40 years ago. But we didn't see very many tipping points 40 years ago. We saw them, but they weren't very frequent. And so that term itself, even though it was created 40 years ago, was not used very much. But now we're seeing tipping point after tipping point. And that tipping point, a tipping point is basically what happens that when something just, well, let's say this is a glass of water. Obviously it's not. But if you tip it a little bit, nothing's going to happen. But especially if the glass of water, as the water starts moving over and putting more weight outside, you might have to tip it quite a way before it falls over. But at some point, as you tip, it suddenly collapses. And that's what happens sometimes with ideas. With concepts, with ideas that are spread being diffused through society, and other things. So when we look at this is comparing, I'm not sure, we might have talked about this last week too. I'll rush ahead if we did. But this is very quickly shows what happened to the sales of print advertising in American newspapers, the rise of Google. You see in 2005, the newspaper industry in America reached its peak, about $48 billion of advertising. But now they're down to about 16, or as of 2014, they're down to about 16 billion print advertising, which is 1/3 of 48, right? So they were lost by 2014. They lost 2/3 of their advertising. And this was black was how much they were making with their online advertising, which almost didn't grow at all in 2014. They didn't know how to. Their print advertising was collapsing. Their online advertising was not growing very much, and their costs were staying too much alike. So as we talked about last week, they started firing people. And again, you see what happened to Google. Similar, growth in something in Facebook and so forth. Looking here, here's another rendition of newspaper revenues. In this case, what's in orange is their digital advertising that they're selling, and what's in black is their print advertising. And again, what you see is the digital advertising is not growing very much at the same time that the print advertising is collapsing. This is the use of smartphones. That's smartphones and other media obviously are stealing the reader, the audience from newspapers. And again, even among the older generation, the use of smartphones is increasing. That also detracts or removes some of the audience from the traditional media, as the older generation picks up, increases their usage of digital media, and that's happening too. You see in America now, even kids up to younger than 11, about half of them have regular access to smartphones. At least that's what they're predicting as of 2020 next year. This is the comparison of advertising, US TV versus digital. And so at this point, TV advertising is not collapsing real bad. It is dropping, but not as badly as newspapers for sure. And but meanwhile, the digital advertising is skyrocketing and leaving them in the dust. If you were to look at the business side and do business research related to newspapers and TV, one of the concepts that a lot of people don't understand. I don't think I have a chart here for it, so I'm going to explain it to you. Well, this is part of the story, though. In America, cable TV stations they're required by the community they're in order to dig up and put their lines into the ground and all this sort of stuff. They are required by local company or local cities and towns to carry their local TV stations. They don't want to put their local TV stations out of business. And so they say, yeah, you can come dig up our streets at your own cost, but while you're putting in your cable lines, you have to run our local TV channels on your cable. And so this is actually where negotiated a really good price with cable companies and retransmission fees. So the cable companies had to pay them retransmission fees in order to carry their stuff on their cable, on cable. And yet, this is what happening to the cable audience. The cable audience is dropping, and I was just reviewing this the other day again. And what I expected was that just like with the newspapers, going back to the newspapers with their revenue, back here, we saw a tipping point in here. You could call it collapse of the newspaper industry as of 2009. Because now the amount of advertising sold in 2009 was dramatically less than in 2008, and it's continued going down. They hoped that maybe it would stop, maybe it'll stabilize, and it wasn't stabilizing. It's still not stabilizing. So we would expect possibly to see the same thing in the TV industry. And so going back to here, this is what's propping it up. Newspapers didn't have this. Newspapers didn't have a cable industry propping them up. But, as I said, along with revenues and audience, I was predicting that we would start seeing a tipping point. It wouldn't just be so small, it would be a fairly major tipping point. And so I think they're predicting, well, one of the sources is predicting that by 2021, this is viewers, they're going to basically they're going to be all the way down in America to 50 million subscribers. So it's been dropping since here, and as of 2021, they expect to be down to 20 million. So it's basically doing the same thing, pretty much as was happening in newspapers in the cable industry. So what happens as cable drops down to 50 million subscribers? Now what's going to happen to the retransmission fees? They have to reduce those. I don't know exactly their legal obligation, what kind of contracts they signed, but if their number of subscribers drops to 50 million, this is in thousands, so they were in over about 1.5 million. Let's see, that can't be right. Cable news. Oh, this is cable news. Okay, so there's now the subscribers. So this is a good chart for that. It gives you an idea of what's happening to cable altogether. So last year, I think it was last year, was still 109 million, and they're expecting a dramatic dropping point to 50 million in the next 2 years. So basically, this is their collapse. This is the tipping point. We're here now, a very definitive tipping point, if they're correct. And that's what I was predicting, is we were going to hit that. In 2016, I wrote a chapter in a book that predicted this was going to happen. And it was based on, this was an older survey about people that were subscribing to cable. the pay TV. And by age, it was the numbers were of the younger ones. They were not even they never did have cable. In the case over in the lower left-hand side, these are the ones who never had cable. 29, about half of them never did have it. And you know, the older generations were still paying for it, but it was dropping fast, even among the older generation. So, yeah, well, this was one of the surveys I looked at 3 years ago when I was writing, actually 4 years ago when I was writing that chapter. That this seems kind of small, but if you're talking about 10% of the people, somewhere around 10 to 20% of the people were saying that they were very likely, or very extremely very or moderately likely to drop pay TV in the next 6 months, 2015. When I was writing that chapter, I could only see that getting worse and worse. I could not see that getting better by any means. And so if you could have 10% then where would it go? It would go deeper and steeper. So they're basically saying the next, from the time of that report that I was showing, they're predicting like 25% drops in the next couple of years to get down to 50 million. I do, as I mentioned before, even though I don't like what I see as bias in the American media right now, that doesn't mean I want to see them all destroyed, because the question becomes, who does? I mean, right now they're doing really bad investigative reporting. Some of them very biased investigative reporting, but do I really want no investigative reporting? Before newspapers became pretty strong about the investigative reporting was done by book writers, and it's still being done by book writers to some extent, book authors, and we may be going back to that. I don't know. If the mainstream media disappears and they've been financing investigative reporting, who's going to finance it next? Okay. I'm going to watch some of these short videos and talk about these. These relate to a lot of the theories, and that's what your test is going to be on in a little while at the end of class. So I want to run through some of these and talk about them. Some of these have more than one name. So what the book talks about, direct effect. Others have called it hypodermic needle, that it's a very direct influence on kind of like, some have pictured it as kind of open head, pour in propaganda. And that was kind of the original, direct effect theory. I'm just going to run some of these. Theory can be used for things like the impact of pornography and sex crimes on the impact of violent games and other media on violent, criminally violent activities. There is a problem in trying to prove that media, and the book talked a lot about this. It has stirred up a lot of research, trying to prove things like that pornography causes rape, that violent games cause violence. And it does fall in this realm that it's difficult to prove. Because if you're going to have a theory has to be predictive. At least that's the idea of a theory. It should be predictive, that you should be able to take a situation and predict that if you apply this treatment, it will result in that. And they've never been able to do that with, maybe partly for ethical reasons, but they can't do that with with things like rape and violent crime. They can't. It's just a matter. If you subject somebody to 20 hours of pornography, will they go and rape somebody? Well, no, they're not going to. That almost certainly they're not going to. However, on the other hand, one of the statistics that is interesting is that in a survey of people in prison for sex crimes, 100% of them used pornography before they broke the law. So, but then you have to ask yourself, did they all use pornography because they're already perverts, so to speak, or did they become perverts from the pornography? Actually, this hits a little bit at home because my daughter married a guy who seemed very nice, but anyway, his brothers had exposed him to pornography when he was like 8 or 9 years old, and he got hooked on pornography at a very young age. He didn't commit a crime, not a legal crime, but he did commit a crime against my daughter, which destroyed her life. She thought he was her best friend and all that, and anyway, it turned out he wasn't so much. That the impact of pornography caused him to do things that broke their marriage vows and really hurt her. So, does it have some effect? I would say, yeah, but it's just very hard with the cultivation theory to prove because it doesn't affect everybody the same. And again, you can't, if you're going to do, I suppose you could, and there are examples where countries, I'm trying to remember which country, there was a country here in Southeast Asia that went from being controlled strictly for pornography, and then they opened it up, and the rate of rape increased dramatically. There are examples like that, but it's anyway. The social scientists say you can't prove it, and it is difficult, obviously difficult to prove, and ethically, like I said, it's kind of you're not going to expect want to do experiments and purposefully subject people to X number of hours of pornography to see if they'll go commit a crime. That's ethically questionable. So there's problems with the cultivation theory. I happen to think it's true. In America, from my experience, Hollywood has always pushed the envelope ethically, morally, and the public follows Hollywood, for example. I'd say most conservatives, who see it that way, that Hollywood, which is 90% liberal, has always pushed the envelope in morality, what we consider morality anyway. Conservatives consider morality, and and the public has gone with Hollywood over the decades, followed them.